So, hello and welcome to this very inspiring Smart Quality Summit. My lecture will be about quality risk management. And just to set the scene, it will not be about new fancy tools, but rather about the mindset of quality management, because I believe without the appropriate spirit, it might not be feasible to accomplish the transition to smart quality. So before I do so, just a few words about myself. So I'm heading the quality unit of Corliss Pharma for 2 years now, and before I was more than 20 years at MorphoSys in different positions as head of QC and director QA. But now about quality. So I'd like to start with a brief introduction into quality risk management, simply explained with my own, hopefully smart words. This will also include what's new about the revised ICH Q9 guideline. Then I would like to share our experience with the managing of quality risks during the transition from paper-based to an electronic quality management system. And I'd like to finish off with just a few thoughts about how quality risk management can leverage your smart quality approach. And then I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. So, introduction into QRM simply explained. So as the most lectures about quality, I also would like to start with the guidelines. But this is not to bore you, but just to emphasize how important quality risk management is seen in the different disciplines of the pharmaceutical industry. So as you may know, the umbrella guideline, as you wish, is the ICH Q9 about quality risk management. But there are also ISO norms about quality systems where risk-based thinking is really a key element. In the EU GMP guideline, the ICH Q9 is completely incorporated, and also you find similar expectations and requirements in the FDA CGMP regulations. Even in the field of good distribution practice, the keyword risk management or risk is mentioned exactly 29 times on 14 pages. So this really shows how important also quality risk management is seen in the distribution field, because today shortages of drug product or drug substance is also seen as a quality risk. I will come to this in more detail than when talking about the revised ICH Q9. Then, of course, in the field of computer system validation, risk management is key. There will be a talk about GAMP just after my talk, and there will also be a talk tomorrow about this topic. And last but not least, in the medical device industry and also in the clinical trial field, good risk management is a key paramount. So you all might know this fancy flow chart from the ICH Q9 guideline, and basically this is copy-pasted in almost all SOPs about quality risk management in the pharmaceutical industry. And it's rather complex. It starts with the initiation of a risk process. Then you have the risk assessment consisting of hazard identification, risk analysis, and then risk evaluation, followed by risk control with risk reduction and risk acceptance. And then you have to communicate all the outputs of this. And finally, you have review events, and everything is equipped with backup loops, feedback loops, and communication on all levels. So this appears to be rather formalistic and complex. And if you explain such scheme to a management which might not be so familiar with quality risk management, this might end up with quite cumbersome discussions. So that's at least my experience, and I would like to learn more about your experience. And for this, I've put a respective question into the Q&A session, and I'm very curious to learn about your feedback here. So some misconceptions I stumbled across in the past were, for example, we use common sense while having a formal QM process, or we follow anyway all applicable guidelines, so what additional risks should we face? Also, risk assessment is fine, but a formal risk control and review process, that's really a bureaucratic overkill, and this interferes with our lean management approach. So also heard in virtual companies, we have outsourced all activities to CMOs. They're responsible to manage our risks. Or we assess risks as part of our change control and deviation management, but what else can we do? And I think one of the reasons for such misconception could be that this process appears to be so complex. So why not explaining this in a much easier way using simply a PDCA cycle? So plan, do, check, and act. So the acting would be the risk assessment itself. Then you have to plan for your preventive actions and you have to implement and control them. This is together called the risk control according to ICH Q9. Then from time to time, you have to review your risk. This is the checking phase. And if you come to the conclusion that you have to revise your risk assessment, this is then the reaction, and you have to reassess your risk assessment. And this would close the cycle, and you have a living process. So now I'd like to come to the different parts of this PDCI cycle, starting with the risk assessment. So after initiation of your risk assessment process, you start with a hazard identification. And this means you have to define your problem, that everyone is on the same page in your multidisciplinary team. And you should ask what could go wrong. And ideally also ask already what could be the potential root cause and the consequence. This will later help you then to define preventive actions. And this is really a brainstorming exercise. So tools like mind mapping or the famous Ishikawa plot can really help to structure your thoughts. Then you have to do the risk analysis, and this means basically you have to quantify risks, rank your risks according to likelihood of occurrence, severity of harm, and detectability. That means, can it be detected before it goes wrong, or at least after it got worse, or before it got worse? Then finally, you have to do the risk evaluation. That means you have to classify risks. For this, you could use a risk matrix with the green, which are the acceptable risks where you do not have to define preventive actions. Then you might have borderline risks in yellow, where you might define preventive actions or justify if not. And then you have the red, the unacceptable risks, where you must define preventive actions to reduce these risks to an acceptable level. And with this acceptance of risk and the definition of preventive actions, you're already in the risk control phase, so the plan and do. That means you have to define your preventive actions to reduce the risk to an acceptable level, and then you have to learn to accept risks. So you cannot reduce all risks to zero, so it's very important exercise also to learn to accept risks to a certain degree. And then you have to set up a preventive action plan. So it's not sufficient to just say, we might have to do this or that. We really have to plan who is doing what and when, like you also set up a CAPA plan. And then you have to implement your preventive actions and then keep them under control. And it means to check if your preventive actions are effective. And with this, you're already in the risk review phase. And this should be done event-driven. So always, if you have an unexpected event, for example, OS, major critical deviations or complaints, if there might be significant changes of the life cycle of your process or system, or even if you get new knowledge about the probability, impact, or detectability of certain risks, you should revise your risk assessment to continuously improve also this process. And then you should focus on key risks if it comes to check if your preventive actions are really effective. This might not be possible to do with all preventive actions. You might focus on those with a high probability of occurrence in case your preventive actions might not be effective. And you also might want to focus on business critical risks. And these kind of risks are these risks which should also be communicated to your management. And with this, we are in the communication phase. And this really should be done on all levels. Start with discussing in your multidisciplinary team openly about the risks, then really be transparent. Do not hide the outputs, the risk assessment report somewhere in a QA silo. Make it really available to all involved stakeholders. Also, meet on a regular basis in an operational team to really check if your risks are under control, if your preventive measures are working. And especially for business critical risks, involve your management. They should be really involved in the acceptance of the risks and approve the risk assessment. For this, you should communicate the risks in a smart manner to your management. And as said, the key risks should be discussed on a regular basis in the quality management review. Here you should really focus on key risks and not bore the management with all the minor risks you might have. So with this, we are already done with the basic requirements of ICH Q9, but now there was a revised version just recently. And the good thing is the basic requirements, as just explained, were not changed. It's really just having additional explanations and clarifications on certain topics, which I personally found very helpful. For example, there's new wording now about the subjectivity of quality risk management processes, and it's clear there's no 100% objectivity in risk assessments. That's a typical criticism of risk management processes, that they are not 100% objective. But the good thing is that new tools like artificial intelligence can really help to get the information you need to get the risk assessment as objective as possible. There was also additional clarification on the formality of quality risk management processes, and it's really stated, and this was already done in the first version, but it's now even clearer: focus resources based on the complexity and risk level. And the more important a risk-based decision is, the higher should be the level of formality. And often, even in the upper management, there might be decisions with deep impact on quality, and there's at least no visible formal process behind. And this is not according to the spirit of quality risk management, according to ICH Q9. Then there was some clarification on the term risk identification, which is now called hazard identification. That's clearly more precise, but finally, I think that's a matter of taste. Then, as already mentioned, product availability risks are also now seen as quality risks. So if there are shortages of product due to GMP compliance issues, this is really seen as a quality risk. And I had really discussions in the past with supply chain management if such risks need to be seen as quality risks, and now we really have clarification on that. And again, risk-based decision making. So really make risk-based informed decisions and allocate your always limited resources intelligent on a risk-based level. So coming in more detail now to this aspect, which I found most important here as message, is really the formality and complexity of risks. So you see all here, these little bugs flying around, these midges, which also constitute risks because they can bite. But if you really try to get all these midges and bugs under control, this might easily eat up all your resources, and then you might overlook or even ignore the elephant in the room. So I really can recommend avoid risk micromanagement to the extent possible and reasonable. So with the words of ICH Q9, the degree of rigor and formality of quality risk management should reflect available knowledge and be commensurate with the level of uncertainty, importance, and complexity of the issue to be addressed. So really focus your risk management resources risk-based. But what really means formality and complexity? So concerning the complexity, importance, and uncertainty, indicator for this might be the multidisciplinarity of your team required to run and control your system or process. It also can mean the involved stakeholders for decision making, the regulatory impact, available knowledge, and of course also business criticality. On the other hand, formality. That means, of course, the comprehensiveness of the risk assessment and the extent of documentation, but it does not stop there. It can also mean the composition of your risk assessment team, the degree of management involvement, and last but not least, the level of quality oversight. So when talking about formality, it's not a good concept to just distinguish between the non-formal and the formal risk assessment. I've heard this on conferences, but I do not think this is a good concept, because all quality processes, at least in a regulated environment, require a certain degree of formality. But what you can do, you might distinguish between basically 3 levels of formality, and there's of course some gradient within these 3 degrees. So the first, most simple one can be if the risk just affecting certain parts of a system or process. This could be a simple change or quality event. In this case, you just might do a qualitative risk assessment and a simple classification according to minor, major, critical, basically doing the risk identification and the risk analysis and evaluation just in one step. So the next level would be degree 2, with less complex or well-established systems like off-the-shelf equipment or software. In this case, you might do a risk ranking list. You might not do a detailed quantification of the risks according to FMEA, for example, but maybe just distinguish between an acceptable risk and a non-acceptable risk where you have to define preventive actions for. And the third level would be really a more complex system and process, or if you have a high degree of uncertainty, or if you have a lot of knowledge. This could also help, of course, to have a very comprehensive risk assessment. And again, business critical systems or processes. This could be production processes, a new supply chain for products, or business critical computerized systems, and the case study will be about. So here you could use FMEA or comparable tools, and you might need more than one FMEA. You might need different risk assessments for different steps of this process. And with this, I'd like to close the introduction of the session and let me briefly summarize so you can see the risk management process as a PDCA cycle: plan, do and check, and act, and do not forget to communicate on all levels. Then you might not forget the elephant in the room, so really focus your resources on the real risks and avoid risk micromanagement if reasonable. And you might follow a graduated approach for formality, so just distinguishing between a non-formal and a formal risk assessment process might not be appropriate. Use a graduated approach. So now coming from the theory to practice. So I'd like to share our experience in managing risks during the transition from paper-based to an electronic quality management system. And actually, this was more than just switching from paper to electronic, and it's a still ongoing process. And our aim was really to bring our different quality management systems, which currently still run more or less independently, together. So on the one hand, we have our GMP quality management system, which we use for our analytical services, the typical document landscape with a quality manual, quality policy, site master file, validation master plan, SOPs, and associated documents and forms. On the other hand, we have the good research practice, as we call it, research quality management system with an umbrella SOP for training and document management and area-specific procedures and supportive documents. And everything still paper-based with a lot of Excel control sheets and other electronic systems. And the idea is now really bringing this all together in one electronic system with a common quality manual describing really all our processes in GMP and research, and a policy which will be put together with input from the complete company, and then having the document landscape for GMP and research all together in one electronic quality management system. We are starting with the document and training management, but later we will also have quality management workflows, CAPA change management, and so on, but also equipment management, vendor management, and last but not least, also risk management. So when talking about risks, we should also talk about opportunities. And according to ISO, there is no opportunity without risk, but there's also no risk without opportunity. So one opportunity is, of course, reduction of paper, and that we can do the review and approval of documents also from remote. We will have a more self-organized training and learning. Currently, all the document training is still done face-to-face in workshops. So this will really relieve our trainers and training managers. We would like to ideally reduce our Excel-based control sheets to 0 if possible. Instead, we'll have well-structured workflows, and in the future also integration of other systems, because currently there are different digitalization projects ongoing. But this is future and will require, of course, an additional risk assessment. So this was our risk management strategy. So we started with the finding phase, which was still rather informal, but here risk communication already started. So we really brought all the stakeholders together, took up their concerns, also made use of their prior experience. And then after we had made up our mind, we started a formal change control process and did here a qualitative short risk assessment, because the most important change action was really to set up a general risk assessment for the switch from paper-based to the electronic system. And this general risk assessment really helped us in the different phases of the project. So starting already during the vendor selection, where it helped us really to find the appropriate questions in the request for proposal process, and also with the qualification of the vendor. And most importantly, it helped also with the decision on-premise or cloud system. At the time, we really were discussing, should we implement an on-premise system or should we go to the cloud? And for this reason, we added risks for on-premise and cloud into our risk assessment. And this really helped us then finally for the decision for the cloud system. We put then all the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats together in a SWOT analysis, which we presented to the management, and then really got a consensus for the cloud system. Then during the qualification of the vendor, again, the right questions were addressed, also using the risk assessment, and this was used for the remote audit and for questionnaires. And most importantly, the most critical risk mitigation measures are those which you have to negotiate in the contract. So to finding the right stipulations, also we use the risk assessment, and this helped really during the contracting to define the risk mitigation measures here by contract. And after having the contract finished, then of course during the implementation, the risk assessment helped, and it also feeded our additional CSV risk assessment, the specific one which we used then to define user acceptance tests. I will not go into detail here. There will be a talk about this topic exactly tomorrow. And then, of course, during the operational phase, risks were addressed. And also, you should already think at that stage about retirement of the system, which you do not like to have, of course, but you should address these risks and should not ignore them. So when thinking about risks, these are also compliance risks. And cloud computing is still, as you wish, somewhere in a gray zone. And for this reason, you should really know about the current thinking about authorities and what's really seen as industry standard. For this reason, we have taken part in a workshop with representatives of the local German authorities and also from Big Pharma. And starting here on the right side, so first of all, document management and learning management systems are regarded quite relaxed and less critical than, for example, cloud-based LIMS or manufacturing execution systems. The requirement of audits is for this reason also to be done risk-based, and it's really expected that you perform a formal risk assessment for such a process. Then you might not be able to audit everything. For this reason, you might rely to a certain extent on IT security certificates and SOC reports, and these should be not only filed, but checked carefully in detail if they are still valid and in scope. Then general data protection requirements must really be stipulated in high detail here in the contract. Also important to know, and you should clearly define your understanding and the understanding of your vendor concerning GMP. For this, you could set up, for example, a quality agreement. And the quality agreement and service level agreement are also important to define responsibilities of the parties. And this is a requirement of Chapter 7 of EU GMP about outsourcing of activities. And here it's also required to have a clear oversight over your vendor. And this could be done, for example, by discussing KPIs on a regular basis. Then, of course, the IT infrastructure of the cloud provider must be qualified. That's a requirement of Annex 11. And as you might know, the Annex 11 of EU GMP is currently under revision. In the future, cloud computing will be a chapter in this new annex. This is good because this brings clarity on one hand. On the other hand, that means that cloud computing might be more in the focus of inspections in the future. So how did we organize our risk assessment process? So first of all, you of course have to constitute a risk assessment team with all disciplines required to really assess and address the risks. Then you should do a kickoff meeting, ideally live, really to have this team building experience and having everyone on the same page and talking about the same things. Then you have to identify your risks, and we have done this first in this kickoff meeting and then done this online, put all the risks together, and then finally met live again to bring everything on the board and check what's still missing. And after this, the risk analysis and risk evaluation. For this, we have transferred our risk in the FMEA table and then worked online on that and met also online and also in live meetings to discuss and rank the risks and agree on appropriate preventive actions. So this was the composition of our risk assessment team, quite dominated in this case by QA. That should not be the case normally, but here we were the system owners, or we are the system owners, and for this reason we had some representatives from QA, but also from IT, and we had a guy from the standard and regulations, but also one really from the operations, really bring every views together here in IT. This was really key. In addition, we had a very experienced CSV manager from our data science team helping us. So as said, the kickoff meeting is really key to set the scene, bring everyone on the same page. So really introduce the process and the applied tools. Not everyone might be similar familiar with these risk assessment tools. Then really clarify the purpose and scope, that everyone really talks about the same thing. And for this, you should really agree on the overall risk question. And this is basically the head of the Ishikawa fishbone. So indeed, you should really define the ultimate consequence of possible threats to the system. Then you should really consider all life cycle phases, starting with the system selection and qualification, the implementation and rollout of the system, but also the requirements for the retirement of your paper-based system should be considered. Then, of course, the operational phase, but as said, do not forget to already think now about a possible retirement of the system or even switch to another system or relocation of a system. And this is also a very important message. Meet live if possible and visualize. So we have really made an old-fashioned approach and just printed out all the identified hazards and put them together on a wall and then sit together and thought what's maybe still missing. And as you can see here, we also had fun here. And I think a risk assessment process needs not to be gray. It really can be fun and a good team building experience. Then also very important to agree on scales. Really consider the uncertainties in your risk assessment process. As said, this can never be completely objective, but rather overestimate and underestimate your risks. So do not to be in the picture, do not shrink the elephant. So for example, for the occurrence, we have started just with the low to medium because we simply had no data to really show that certain hazards have a very low likeliness of occurrence. So really rather overestimate and start with, for example, low to medium. And also very important to really agree on the impact scaling. So what's really the impact? So for some members in your team, it might be even a critical risk if there might be a major finding during an audit or inspection. For others, just the fire or earthquake would be a critical one. So really agree on examples, really put examples on the table and really agree on this. Otherwise, it might be really hard to come to an agreement here concerning likeliness and impact. But having really this defined upfront really helps to a very streamlined and efficient risk assessment process. So let me briefly summarize the outcome of our risk assessment. So for all the different phases, we have identified about 50 potential hazards. That's not too much because we really try to avoid risk micromanagement here. And we did not find any unacceptable risks for cloud-based solution, provided that the defined preventive actions are implemented. And these were, for example, careful selection and qualification of the cloud service provider, said stipulation of risk mitigation measures within the service level agreement, and not only relying on the disaster recovery and backup of the service provider of the cloud, but also define own disaster recovery and backup strategies. There is still concern of the dependency from the cloud service provider. This is there, cannot be ignored. But however, the benefits of the cloud really counterweight this dependency you're getting in. And of course, the general threat today is energy blackouts or even hacker attacks. This should not be ignored, of course, but need to be accepted to a certain extent, because otherwise any digitalization is, of course, not feasible, either not on-premise or on cloud. So let me briefly summarize again. The quality risk assessment process really helped us to make a risk-based decision in favor of a cloud system. So really have an informed decision here, and to select and qualify the service provider, asking the right question, risk-based, and also stipulate risk mitigating measures in the contractual framework. And as said, not rely completely on the cloud provider, having also robust backup and disaster recovery processes established. And finally, of course, it helped then also to set up a risk-based computer system validation strategy. Now, just a few thoughts about how quality risk management can strengthen your building blocks of smart quality. Quality risk management is a promoter of a smart quality culture. So especially in regulated fields, there's often quite some risk aversion, and a risk assessment process can really help to promote a culture of risk awareness instead of risk aversion. It can really be a good exercise to bring multifunctional teams together and face risks also together as a team. And last but not least, it can foster rational decision-making processes as just described. Then talking about smart quality assurance. So again, focus your resources also here. That means focus your resources for root cause investigations and kappa definitions, because not all minor deviations might require really in-depth root cause investigation and definition of corrective and preventive actions. Sometimes a simple correction is sufficient. So avoid to die the death by kappas, to be overwhelmed by your kappa processes, which also can easily eat up your resources if it is not done risk-based. So really decide which non-conformity might really have a higher probability of recurrence and has really deep impact, and you should really focus on these. And really to check this, smart electronic systems can of course help to gather the information concerning non-conformities with similar root causes. It can help then to really assess the likeliness of recurrence, and of course you can also assess the impact, and this should be used as basis to your kappa definition. This is also described in the WHO guideline deviation handling and quality risk management. So this was designed for manufacturers of vaccines, but these basic principles are also applicable for other disciplines, and I really can recommend to read this guideline. Then one topic which really I thought a lot of in the past was really how can especially virtual companies having an overarching risk-based concept to oversee all the different processes within their network of CMOs, contract research organization, contract logistic organizations, and so on. And really having here a good overarching strategy would be extremely helpful. And I would really love to hear about this maybe in one of the next Smart Quality Summits. And with this, I'm already at the end, and my final take-home message is no risk, no fun, or much better, no risk management, no fun. And with this, I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bodo, for this informative and insightful presentation on risk management. You're calling in from Munich, so we are very pleased to have you here. And before we go to the Q&A, let's go to the poll. We want to hear the answers of our audience first. So you can scan the QR code, and we are very curious to have your opinions and your answers, so please don't hesitate to participate. And we will proceed with the first question. Let's have a look. Here it is. It's a long question or a lot of answers. What is your experience when discussing the requirements of formal QRM with colleagues or the management? A. Management is open and willing to support the QRM process. B. Management does not care as long as QA will manage everything and other departments are not affected too much. C. Management is reluctant to spend resources as it is not clear if QRM will pay out. D. Colleagues are interested to be part of the QRM team and are willing to take over responsibility. And D. Colleagues are only willing to participate if it is finally going to be more or less a QA one-man show. So, as the votes are coming in, there is quite a division on the answer, quite a diversity. Proportionate, apparently. So more or less 30% says the first answer. Yeah, it's proportionate. I have the impression. I will close the votes soon, but you can see that everything is more or less the same in percentages, 30% more or less. Is that something that you had predicted, Bodo?
No, I had really no idea what's coming out here, so very interesting to see.
Well, the results, the definitive results are 33% for the first answer. Colleagues are only willing, sorry, not the first answer, for colleagues are only willing to participate if it is finally going to be more or less a QA one-man show. So for the last answer. Any comments on this? Bodo, what do you think? You didn't expect this to be the most
From my own experience, I more or less expected this, but it's interesting to see that others have similar experience.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your votes. Let's go to the second question. And the second question is, how do you deal with the formality of risk management? We always use the same procedure and tool, FMEA. We use a flexible toolbox depending on complexity and importance of the issue. We have a non-formal process for less complex issues and a formal process for more complex issues. And we have not established a formal risk management process. What are your answers? So far, 67% says we always use the same procedure and tool. And nobody answered we have a non-formal process for less complex issues and a formal process for more complex issues. But that has changed. So Bodo, you can see the results with me, I believe.
Very interesting to see this.
Okay. And what can you conclude?
I think if MEA can also be, of course, flexible. You can have it more complex or less complex. So I think that's absolutely fine to use this. But you could also think about less complex tools than FMEA, of course.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The third question is about to pop on my screen, at least. Maybe you can already see it. How do you perform risk analysis? We gather detailed data to generate as objective risk priority numbers as possible. We discuss and agree on numbers in a multidisciplinary team. Probability, impact, and detectability are guessed by an expert in the field, and we only do a qualitative description of risks. So what are your votes? What is in place at your organization? Up till now, the majority says probability, impact, and detectability are guessed by an expert in the field. But we are waiting just a little bit more. Now it's changing.
Okay.
It's still the majority, but you discuss and agree on numbers in a multidisciplinary team for 44%, sorry. And now it has changed. It's 50-50.
It's pari now. Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
interesting to see that sometimes, obviously, risk assessment really done by one person just sitting on his desk. I think this is not a good idea. I would really highly recommend to do this together in team.
Absolutely. That's already a very good takeaway. And well, I believe these were the 3 questions for the poll. So now we can delve into the questions. Okay, let's see. Chantal van Gorp, for EQMS implementation, can you perform risk assessments based on URS?
I can hardly understand you. It's interrupted.
Okay, I will repeat. For EQMS implementation, can you perform risk assessments based on URS?
Yeah, that's the second part we have done. So we have done basically 2 risk assessments, one general and then the more specific one after we have decided for the system. And then we have done the risk assessment based on the user requirement specifications we have defined to define then the degree of user acceptance testing. Yeah, this was the second risk assessment we have done. Did not go into detail here because I think there will be talk tomorrow about this.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Manon de Couilleur. Do you address risk for QMS processes or procedures the same way as production risk management?
Good question. So as said, it should be done risk-based, and production processes might have the highest risk. And for this reason, they might be more formal than assessing risks for quality management system. But I think you cannot answer this generally.
Mm-hmm. And what would be then factors to take into account to be able to answer that question?
I think finally you always have to think what are the final risks for your patients, and the more risks are there for patients, the more formal should be your process behind this.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Another question also from Chantal van Gorp. Do all risk assessments be done with multidisciplinary teams? Do all risk assessments be done with multidisciplinary teams?
I think the more complex the risk is, the more multidisciplinary should the team be. But I can only highly recommend always do this together, at least with another one or two people really to discuss. Need not to be maybe multidisciplinary if it's quite focused, but you should never sit alone and assess risks.
Yeah. Yeah, as we already discussed during the poll, absolutely.
Right.
What were the main risks identified for an on-premises EQMS solution?
So I think basically one of the most important risks that we have seen was really lack of resources to maintain such a system and keep it on track. Because IT is always limited in resources, I think in almost all companies, and this was one of the basic risks we've seen, most important risks.
So it's something you can anticipate, actually, or not?
It's hardly to anticipate, of course, because there might also be fluctuations in your personnel, and if one is leaving the company with the main knowledge for the system, that could be really big risk for the complete system.
Okay, so documenting is here also a very important point.
Yeah, of course, the knowledge should be documented to reduce this risk. That's true. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Should QA be the owner of all QRM processes?
Absolutely not, I would say. So the expert in the field should be the owner, and QA should support this. So normally, QA should really more in the background, I would say.
Yeah.
Although, of course, if QA is the system owner, as in our case, it might be different. But in case of a production processor, so of course, QA should not be the owner of the risk processes.
Okay. Let us see. I think I've had all the questions. Oh no, there's a new one coming in by Christina. Is auditing of a cloud service provider really a risk-based decision or rather a mandatory requirement?
It's a very good question. So we've really had different opinions. So from a German authority, there was really the clear statement it should be done risk-based. And for example, for a learning management system, the risk might not be so high. So maybe a questionnaire could be also sufficient. But of course, for a LIMS system or for manufacturing execution system, I can only highly recommend really to do the audit, and if possible on site, but at least remotely.
Okay. All right. I think we had all the questions. If there is a question coming up later on, don't hesitate. But for now, I will thank our speaker. Thank you, Bodo, for being here. It was a pleasure, and I wish you a good continuation of your day.
It was a pleasure for me as well. Thank you very much.